was 1948, and at 17 I'd just graduated from high school and enrolled at LSU, just a few miles from home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I majored in speech and was in several LSU three-act plays, and featured on the front page of the LSU paper, The Daily Reveille. There I am in the lower right, getting a drink. And about this time, I also got some press for the first documentary film I produced about a tribe of Louisiana Indians. But back in those pre-TV days, my main interest drifted towards radio broadcasting. I got in front of the mic as often as I could at the university's FM station, WLSU. And I even landed a part-time announcer job at a local commercial station. Yep, I figured to be a radio personality one day. But towards the end of my sophomore year in 1950, the Korean War broke out. Lots of guys my age were drafted and sent into combat, and some I knew were later killed. Well, that was pretty scary. LSU had a reserve officers training program, and I figured if I was destined for Army duty and possible combat, I'd be better off taking ROTC and graduating as a commissioned officer. And maybe within a couple of years the war would end. Well, I had two branch choices, infantry or artillery. Well, I chose artillery as the lesser of two evils. And during the summer before my senior year, I joined a bunch of other ROTC cadets for a mandatory 6-week summer camp at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the big artillery base. I took along my new Bolex movie camera and shot some footage of us sad sacks piling out of our tents and dressing right. At Fort Sill, we marched and paraded, but most of all, we got training in becoming artillery officers, attending classes, and venturing out on the firing range with the big howitzers. Learned how to become FOs, forward observers, the most dangerous duty for an artillery officer. You're up on the front lines with a pair of binoculars with which you spot enemy targets, and then you call back to the gun battery to direct rounds of fire, and hope like heck they hit the target. Well, it wasn't much fun, but I managed to parody the FO in one of several cartoons I drew for the camp annual. I finished my senior year at LSU and got my academic degree. And then, like this graduate, I received my commission and my gold bars. I was now a full-fledged second lieutenant, a shaved tail in the U.S. Army Artillery. And the price for college draft deferment and a commission was an immediate 2-year tour of active duty. Well, as a graduation gift to myself, I treated myself to a 3-year-old Lincoln Cosmopolitan. And on September 1st, 1952, I drove it back to Fort Sill for a 15-week officers training school, similar to the summer camp, only much more intensive. And then I was assigned duty at Camp Polk, Louisiana, where I whittled away the time trying to keep busy. The most enjoyable thing I did there was take an Army projectionist class, even though I already knew how to run most audiovisual equipment. Well, I also got my official Geneva Convention ID card, just in case I got captured in combat. And that was a real worry, because the fighting was still hot in Korea. And then the dreaded orders came. I was assigned to duty in Korea. So in July of 1953, with a heavy heart and sad goodbyes, I flew from Baton Rouge to Camp Stonnell, California to await my overseas shipment orders, which finally came after 10 days there. But I knew God was watching over me because the truce was signed just 2 days before I shipped out. I joined hundreds of other soldiers aboard the Marine Phoenix, a huge troop ship, for a lengthy cruise across the blue Pacific. And when we crossed the 180th meridian, that's the international date line, We were all inducted into the Order of the Golden Dragon. Well, I never did get any benefits from that. We sailed along the southern tip of Japan and finally landed at Sasebo. And after processing there, some of us sailed on to Incheon, Korea. From Incheon, we went by truck to Seoul, Korea's war-torn capital city. And at Seoul, I boarded an old steam train for a 60-mile, 6-hour journey to my final destination near Chuncheon, just below the famous 38th parallel and the actual armistice line dividing North and South Korea. Well, the Chuncheon area was near the Chorwan Reservoir and the location of my assignment as an officer with Battery A of the 981st Field Artillery Battalion of the 40th Infantry Division. Well, I didn't expect it to be like home, and it wasn't. All the enlisted men lived in large tents, and even we junior officers shared a crowded tent. Only our battery commander, Captain Bevatory, enjoyed the comforts of a private hoochie. Oh, we did have a PX. Not exactly Walmart, but you could get the basics, toothpaste and toilet paper. And next door, the men were building something else. Could it be a Hard Rock Cafe? Well, probably a new latrine, because there wasn't any running water here. In any case, I was welcomed by the other officers, who did their best to make me feel at home. Actually, our battery had a full strength of junior officers, and I discovered there really wasn't enough work to keep us all happily busy. With hostilities over, everyone was trying to adjust to life without combat. And typical of the Army's custom of assigning people to jobs they're not qualified for, I was appointed motor pool officer, overseeing vehicle maintenance and making sure the Jeeps were all lined up evenly for inspection, which seemed to happen often. And these are Katusas, Koreans attached to the U.S. Army, lined up for inspection and trying to look like capable soldiers, which they weren't. Of course, we played war games to keep combat ready. The same old stuff, one day as safety officer for the big guns, then the next day forward observer atop a hill to practice looking for mock targets. But there was a little time for sightseeing, if that's what you could call a day's drive around the nearby countryside. At one time, these were probably community buildings or schools, till the enemy reduced them to hollow shells. And I discovered this steam train that had suffered an air attack in the recent fighting. It lay rusting in a field, and the rails on either end had long since been salvaged. The semaphore stood frozen in a perpetual stop position. But Korea wasn't all desolation. If you searched enough, you could find some picturesque views in this land of the morning calm, as Korea is known. Unlike the cities, the country air was fresh, except for the occasional stink of kimchi cooking in the village huts. And life in the villages was busier than ever, as the people began rebuilding and adjusting to a new and peaceful life. All of Korea, north and south, is slightly larger than the state of Kansas. Its history dates back to 2300 BC, and much of it under the domination of one foreign power or another. And yet, these people have experienced over 4,000 years of unbroken culture. Just about everything in the villages was done with primitive tools and lots of human labor. There was little about Korea to remind one of home, but with an open mind and a curiosity for things different, you soon overlooked this fact, and you discovered new people and experiences. A shaky peace had returned to the country, and the villagers were optimistic about a happier future. Youngsters were back in school, and in their faces was a hint of hope and the wonderment of youth. And not everyone earned their livelihood the hard way. Every village had its Josans, waiting for the GIs. Well, back at Able Battery, I might look happy, but inside I was never really at home around the howitzers or gazing through the forward observer scopes. After all, my expertise was radio broadcasting, and when I learned that the Armed Forces Radio Service operated stations under the American Forces Korea Network, I took time to visit the nearest station, known as AFKN Rambler. The officer in charge told me that AFKN had 9 AM stations located around South Korea to serve the U.S. troops with information and stateside radio entertainment. Later, I took these photos of some of the stations, each of which had names rather than call letters. Those near the recent combat zones had names suggesting their mobility in case of attack, like Vagabond and Rambler, Gypsy, Nomad, and Troubadour. And in the less vulnerable southern zones were names like Homesteader and Kilroy. And each station was under the management of an officer in charge, usually a lieutenant or a captain. Well, hope was on the horizon. I promptly wrote a letter requesting a transfer, and after much exchange of correspondence, I was granted reassignment to AFKN. At last, I could look forward to the kind of interesting work that I was qualified for. It was mid-October 1953 when I took an overnight train from the Chorwan Valley down to the city of Daegu, headquarters of AFKN. And after a week's orientation, I was assigned as officer in charge of AFKN Troubadour, back up north in the Quandary area, a small round valley traversed by a large river and surrounded by a double ring of mountains. Located here was 10th Corps, the second largest tactical unit in South Korea, and the mission of AFKN Troubadour was to serve this sprawling command post with good old American-style radio. For the most effective signal transmission, our station was situated in a small saddle about 8 miles on top of a hill from 10th Corps headquarters. This would be my home and workplace for the next 6 months. And I was welcomed to Troubadour by Lieutenant Tom Wood, the officer I was replacing. He gave me a helpful orientation before he left for the States. Now, this black and white photo shows our facility pretty much as it appeared when I arrived. And here's the perimeter of our compound, surrounded by a fence. And it's hard to tell in the photo, but we were quite high up. There's a big drop-off in the middle, about the middle of the picture. Far in the distance is 10th Corps headquarters, complete with its own airstrip, from which I used to fly off to meetings. Here's the Soyang River, where 10th Corps GIs swam in the summer. And directly below our hill were large engineer and signal battalions. The approach to our station was up a steep dirt road and into the compound entrance. We even had a tiny visitor parking space, but no handicap spots. This was our fuel storage. We used propane for heat, diesel fuel for our generators, and of course gasoline for the vehicles. And then across the lot was our main broadcast studio. The van housed our on-air control room, where the announcers manned their shifts, playing records and running shows. The van was backed up and open into this Quonset, which housed record libraries, a small studio for off-air recording, and offices, including mine, of course. Incidentally, the van was left over from the combat days, when the station had to be more mobile, and since hostilities had ended, we became much more settled, and soon we yanked the van out and remodeled the inside of the Quonset. This later photo shows a more inviting studio entrance. But then back to this scene. Here's our little mess hall, equipped with a propane stove and table and chairs. No running water, of course, so we had to haul that up in a water truck. Well, I didn't eat here very much, sometimes breakfast and occasionally lunch. I'd usually have dinner down at 10th Corps. Now this is our power shed, housing 2 diesel generators to supply electricity for our broadcasting and lighting our facility. The generators were forever breaking down, and we'd have to get emergency help from the engineer battalion. Being off the air was a serious no-no. The general at 10th Corps would miss his newscasts. And behind the generator shed was a little shack, the home of our Korean houseboys. Here's Lee Ki-bong, Skoshi we called him, meaning small. He was 15. And this is Lee Young-duck, even younger. They'd do cleaning, fuel vehicles, and other chores. Some were war orphans, but they were really good kids. Now this van houses our 1,000-watt AM transmitter. I'd inspect it now and then, but it didn't give us much trouble like the generators did. Incidentally, the tall poles around the compound support our antenna system. And then here's my home away from home, my little hoochie. About 10 feet square, with a cot, table, wash basin, and a propane stove for warmth and to heat water. For a shower, I had to hop in one of these drafty jeeps from our little motor pool and drive 8 miles to 10th Corps headquarters. Pretty invigorating on a sub-freezing night. Then here's the enlisted men's tent. We had a staff of about 5 or 6 announcers and continuity guys and 1 engineer. We'll meet some of them later. And then down below their tent was a basketball court and a most important little building, the latrine, a good old-fashioned 2-holer. Well, here it is in this shot, safely downwind from our studio. And this same photo shows the road to 10th Corps headquarters, way down below our hill. So let's hop on down for some fun. The road spanned this river over a long bridge, and then across from the battalions below us, to the big 10th Corps headquarters. I used to spend a lot of time down there after hours. You could shop for bargains at the PX, because there wasn't much else to spend your meager pay on over here. And there were non-denominational worship services in the Quonset Chapel. It was really quite nice inside. And we could catch the latest movies at the Jade Theater, the only 35mm movie house north of Seoul. Even the facilities were fancier. The honeyman was vital to the Korean farmers. He gathered human waste to sell for fertilizer. But on to better things at day's end. I'd usually start with a beer in the Jade Room of the Officers' Club, and then I'd have dinner there with friends. One of them was Captain Bob Powers. He was Troop Information and Education Officer at 10th Corps. We'd often spend the evening up at Troubadour listening to Bob and Ray records. But the days were busy at Troubadour. We were on the air 22 hours a day, all night long, shutting down from 8 a.m. to 10 for routine maintenance. Inside the Quonset, the day staff would be at work. We had a huge record library, and although we had tape recorders, all our regular programming was on big 16-inch radio transcriptions, including the latest stateside shows. TV was in its infancy then, and radio was still big entertainment. Of course, my favorite was Bob and Ray. They were at their peak in the early 50s.
From approximately coast to coast, it's the Bob and Ray Show.
Starring Bob Elliott and Ray Goulding in full natural color.
With Mary Magoon, Tex, Webley Webster, and Wally Ballou.
The announcers kept our station going. They each had their own DJ shows, and they were pros. Jim Rodeo was a big band jazz expert.
Well, best you light up a cigarette because we are here with the sounds today on the Record Shop. The Friday edition, and we're going to look over the 1953 downbeat poll and some of the musicians that made good in that poll. So we'd say that it's not so much the sounds
Jim
today,
Wilson had an early morning DJ show.
Well, that just about wraps things up for this morning time in Tuners, but of course we'll see you again tomorrow morning comes 6 o'clock. So until then, this is the early bird himself, Army PFC Jim Wilson, wishing each and all a very pleasant and safe day. Until tomorrow now, take it easy. This is the American Forces Korea Network. Look to the future with your savings secured in Soldier's Deposit. Yes, see your unit personnel officer today about Soldier's Deposit. Find out why it's the best way for you to save. Your dial is set at 1320 Troubadour. We take you now to...
Howdy there, good friends and neighbors. It's time again for Hillbilly Hits, and this is your Carolina neighbor inviting
Bill Brown was right at home with country western.
Yep, we've got a whole stack of favorite hillbilly records all picked out here just waiting to be played. So make yourself right at home and enjoy the music. We're always glad to have you, whoever and wherever you are. Now to get
This is the American Forces Korea Network.
Tom Leader's at a late evening shift.
Here's the weather forecast for the Troubadour listening area. Cloudy tonight and tomorrow, with low temperatures tonight of 30 to 35 degrees, the high tomorrow 42 to 47. Present temperature 38 degrees. This is Troubadour, 5 minutes past 11 o'clock.
Tom was starting his classical music show. Of course, we had other announcers, too. And I didn't spend all my time behind the desk. Once in a while, I'd take a turn at the mic.
Listen again at this same time next week, when again we present Family Theater. This is the United States Armed Forces Radio Service.
And this is the American Forces Korea Network. Army teamwork is the same as that of a football squad. Every man of that team must realize that if he doesn't do his part, the team can't expect to win. It takes the combined effort of every man to accomplish the task set before us. So do your best to ensure the success of your Army unit team. Help develop team spirit. At 1320 on your dial, this is Troubadour. It's 8:30.
It's Fibber McGee and Molly.
Now and then, we'd do a remote broadcast, like a football game or a big ceremony at 10th Corps headquarters. And keeping the equipment running was our engineer, Airman Leroy Myers, behind the camera here, next to announcer Jim Wilson. Well, soon the autumn days grew shorter, and the nights got colder, and one day we awoke to fresh snow. We had to keep the propane heaters going in the mess hall and everywhere else, in fact. But the clouds rolled away, leaving a beautiful December day. At Troubadour, I spent my 23rd birthday and my first Christmas away from home. We tried to make it festive with a tree in our studio, and I even had a little tiny one in my uchi. Well, it was pretty pitiful, but I had a couple of presents from home under it, and even a card from Korea's Minister of National Defense. What a thrill. Well, one December day, I was at my desk when I got a phone call from a Signal Corps officer who'd come to 10th Corps to film a ceremony at Corps headquarters. And he wanted to use one of my announcers to conduct some interviews. Well, it turned out he was a friend that I'd met a year ago back at Fort Sill, Lieutenant Conrad Wallstein. And here he is on the right in the shot of the two of us. I grabbed announcer Bill Brown, and we drove down to Corps headquarters, where I watched them film some interviews of GIs for release to their hometown TV stations.
This is a TV hometown release run here at Fort Signal.
Well, here's PFC Bill Brown conducting a hometown interview.
Here's a very special hello to all you folks back there in the state of Mississippi. This is Army PFC Bill Brown of the American Forces Korea Network and radio station Troubadour, speaking to you from the Quandaree Valley on the 38th parallel in Korea.
Well, the sound man must have had too much sake because the audio is terrible.
This afternoon we have a young man who is a native of Mississippi, and right now we'd like to call on him. Would you come over here, please? Would you tell us your name?
Private L.D. Stringfellow.
L.D. Stringfellow. And where are you from, L.D.?
I'm from Loosedale, Mississippi.
L.D., would you like to say a few words to the folks back home now?
Well, Bill, I'd like to say hello to all the folks back there in Mississippi and wish them all a very Merry Christmas this year, and hope that I'm back there with them next year to enjoy it.
L.D., it's been a real pleasure having you with us this afternoon, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Bill.
This is Army PFC Bill Brown of the American Forces Korea Network radio station Troubadour, speaking to you from the Quandaree Valley on the 38th parallel in Korea. And now from Korea, back to the United States.
After the filming was over, there was a short end of film still in the camera, so Conrad and I finished it off with a few comments.
Hello, this is Lieutenant Wallstein. After the wind-up on General Clark that we just saw here, we were expecting to see General Clark present the check for the Pusan relief that had been collected from the men of this area, but unfortunately that event didn't take place. Here we have Lieutenant Stonnell from
radio station Troubadour of the American Forces Korea Network. And our job today was to make a recording of the events as they happened. We hope for eventual release in the States. And I thought the whole ceremony was very colorful and interesting, wasn't it?
Right, it's unfortunate. It's right. Actually, it's very unfortunate that President Reed...
Well, we'll never know what Sigmund Rhee didn't do because the film ran out. Well, one of the perks of duty at a radio station was that we had tape recorders, and I could exchange news tapes with Mom, Dad, and my 7-year-old sister Ginger back home.
Your bow, Jack. Today we got your letter where you said that you had gone down to Taegu. You're really getting there, aren't you, boy? Flying around there and doing all that stuff?
Jack, no, I want to say, honey, that we enjoyed your letter so much today. It had been quite a while since we heard, but we know you're awfully busy, and we just look forward to your letters, and now we're looking forward to your tapes coming, for we have enjoyed over and over again every tape. Well, Ginger wants to say something now.
Oh, yeah.
Kitty's sitting here, and looks like he wants to say something, loving me and purring and everything. Pulling his head off, and...
Tell Jack you're sending him a Valentine.
I'm going to send you a Valentine, Jack. Daddy's going to mail it tomorrow.
I sure look forward to every tape from home. In March of 1954, I took R&R, a week's vacation in Tokyo. I even made a little movie from footage I shot with a camera that I borrowed from Conrad Wallstein, who was stationed in Tokyo. The Emperor's Palace is a major attraction in Tokyo. Visitors weren't permitted to go inside, but many Japanese tourists joined me in a stroll around the grounds. Although Tokyo has changed a lot since 1954, I was even then impressed with its size and its cosmopolitan activity, with no sign of destruction left over from World War II. Big city life was an exciting change from the Korean boondocks.
Met a girl in kimono strolling along the Ginza. On her hair were splendid hairpins made of tortoiseshell. Cute was she like a doll of cherry blossom land. Everybody feels so gay when they look at her.
I stayed at a comfortable Western-style hotel with all the conveniences for $8 a night. Those notorious high prices that we hear about today hadn't begun to emerge back then. Here's the famous Imperial Hotel, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright and built to be earthquake-proof. It's here where the world's dignitaries stayed. The hotel was demolished in 1968, but not from an earthquake. Even back in 1954, Tokyo was a glitzy city, and after 6 months in Korea, it was good to see some neon, even if it was all red. My visit included performances of the Tokyo Symphony and Swan Lake Ballet, plus lots of great dining. A week in civilization was a refreshing break. And right on the heels of my return to Troubadour, I got my orders to return to the States. My tour of duty was over. Well, it didn't take me long to pack my duffel bags and head for Busan, my port of departure. I arrived by train on a mild April afternoon. Believe me, I was one happy GI that day. And I wasn't the only GI heading for home. I can't say I fell in love with Korea, but as I sailed back over the Pacific, I came to realize that I'd had really a very unique experience. And as this little movie attests, I haven't forgotten it.